Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, my precious pack, and welcome back once more to Vega Conflict, the game that sucks your soul out. Today I wanted to talk about something fairly simple, fairly straightforward, and just more or less keep it fairly short. That is my current fittings for my ships. Now, each of them has a very specific role, the switch being the most prominent in just about every single regard, at least until I start upgrading my Taurus, which I should probably start farming for because we're coming towards the end of the month, but we're not going to talk about that. First up is the switches. What are they for and what are they built for? As you can see, they have a general shield fitting, which you change it to whatever you need it to for the target, but the general armor fitting, specials fitting, weapons fitting, the background, that just doesn't change. None of that changes. They are, by all intents and purposes, just a straightforward vessel. First and foremost is they excel at auto-farming their own targets, especially when you have more than one fleet, as I do. Because I just don't care about the repair times, and what I do is I will take the ships that are most heavily damaged from each fight, put them in a separate fleet and begin repairing them, and then replace them with spare ships that I have, which could be used in any number of situations. So, in this case, the switches actually prove to be the most prominent of the vessels I use, period, even now, even after I have my Taurus, just because of how versatile they are. First and foremost, since I already have them up to Mark V, it's easy to farm for the Mark V and Mark VI upgrades, but I haven't upgraded any of them to Elite yet because I don't see any reason to, because I've basically maxed them out with what I want, and I don't feel like taking the time to start putting resistors on them, because one day a pop doesn't seem like a very good reason to fit them, and I honestly don't care about their repair time. I just want them to be able to efficiently take targets out in a timely manner for me to be able to more or less farm the targets quickly, get what I want, then log out. They do this in one of two ways. First off, during the initial portion of Tier 9, we saw a heavy spam of spawners in the targets. Rife Missile is a great counter to this, and it continues to be so. Secondarily, we had the Ajax 2.0s in almost every single target. Well, actually, I don't think there's a single target that we haven't encountered yet where there isn't at least one or more. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but I haven't hit all the targets, because, I'm not collecting any of the reusable items. This is all for me to just auto-farm without any intentions of building up better fleets. So, combat-wise, they have some bypass to help deal with the Ajaxes and anything else that's more durable than it should be, which happens quite often. Other than that, the shield fittings change quite often whenever you need them to be specialized against any specific damage type, such as energy or kinetic. Kinetic, as of lately, has been a huge issue. Not player-wise, but mainly NPC-wise. I've been hit pretty hard by some of the NPCs' kinetic weapons. I don't know what they're using, but it's definitely not. I can't say it has bypass, or if it does, I just don't notice it doing too much to the shielding, because most of the time I have the improper shield fit, and it just seems to be hitting pretty hard. But yeah, don't want to linger too much on them. Second fleet of them is the same, and the third fleet will more or less be the same, because I have no intention of doing anything else with them other than just mass-producing them and farming them. I built 2 fleets of Breachers up to Mark IV because I wanted to test them and see what they could do. Naturally, this didn't really work out too well, because the breakers, as I see them, they're just not as good as the switches. While yes, they do have all the increased shield damage and stuff like that, they actually missed a mark that I actually see as being necessary. Especially when you're dealing with the Ajax 2.0, because when you have increased shield damage, you trigger their overdrive faster and faster. So, Generation 1, which is what you see right here, I deemed it a failure because it just didn't work out, so I started repurposing them to do other things or for general use testing. Didn't really test them too much because I started producing switches again and just forgot about them. Generation 2 was built with a bypass build, but also with the ability to clear larger waves of NPC spawns. The intention was to try and hopefully make it so that they could go into the switch targets and clear them out. They can't do that, so if you see this fitting, don't even bother copying it, because it just doesn't work out, sadly. As for the Taurus, I started off with a fitting that I actually need to go back to partially. So, right now it has one weakness. If it's rushed, it can't do anything about it. But for the most part, it is safe because it has its spawns, it's heavily armored, and it has heavy bypass. And so far, it can auto a few targets for reasonable repair time, as well as actually take out some of the more durable vessels once its prime shift is active. So it can do a little bit, especially when you're actively controlling it. Some of the higher level targets are a lot easier to farm with it as well. And then the fourth fleet, as I said, they're just going to be a mimic of the first two. Well, the third fleet. And as for the Commandant Carrier, I finally had plenty of time to playtest with it, and I can finally say that don't bother wasting your time actually trying to farm and upgrade it, because through testing, as I said before in my previous video, I was correct in how I play with saying that I wouldn't be able to mix it in because it doesn't pair with an auto fleet of switches, and they're like the prominent vessel I use currently, as you can tell. And it just doesn't pair well with them in auto, and it doesn't pair well with them when I'm actually mainly playing with them. Because in one case, at the beginning of the fight, it's too quick to maintain fleet formation, it gets out of place very quickly. And in the later portion of the battle, where I need everything to be quick pace so I could clean up the fight and get out and get into the next target as quickly as possible, it is too slow. So at the beginning, it's too fast and it just doesn't work out in the end, and in the end, it's too slow. Damage-wise, if the enemy doesn't have explosive shielding, it does pretty well. But when the squadrons are being focused on by anything, they don't last long at all. Even with it active, I saw them being mostly one-shotted by most of the targets I was farming for. I couldn't even use it alone or with a fleet to farm for its own upgrades without the fleet taking a heavy amount of damage. And I really could have used a 6th switch in the fleet over a commandant, and it would have been more effective. So where I said before that it might have been good at kiting, I do have a little bit of footage of it kiting, but it's not tier 9 target, it's a tier 8 sadly. So I just, every time I used it against tier 9 targets, it just didn't really excel. It was taking far too long to do much damage in any regard, so I decided that it would be best to not really use it just because it was struggling. And by all intents and purposes, now that I actually have had time to practice with it, and trying to mix it in with the fleets that I'm actively using because they have had the best momentum for what I'm doing, I do think that it could use a buff or something like that, but aside from that, I don't have too much of an opinion on it because it... Does it not have damage, health, range, cargo, mass, speed? Where is its shield stat at? Okay, that's... I have no idea why that's gone, but it doesn't... It does bug me that it's not visually there, but again, getting back on track since I was distracted by that. Tired mind just going running off with that. Overall, I do think it could use a second workover by the development team, and what I would say is actually see what the general prognosis is or what the general thoughts are in regards to it itself, because I wouldn't want to just throw my ideas in alone, because I do want it to be able to solo just about everything, but take a little bit of time so it's an actively played vessel to be able to get what you want. But I don't want it to be able to go into auto fleets and stuff like that, because again, even in auto, I don't think even after it's buffed, it'd be able to support the fleets as I think it would be able to. And it does actually have a decent prime shift bonus of the trigger time and everything like that. And it has a very quick charge time when it's in combat of 11% basically. I mean, that's just outstanding. But when it comes right down to it, it's actually not all too good, because its main thing is actually bolster, which is its like go-to amazing feature. But its actual prime shift, it just, as I said earlier, in the test that I was taking the targets on, the moment the squadrons get focused on, they're on a target, they don't last long. They just get ripped apart. Even with all the health bonuses, they just get ripped to pieces, and there's not much you can do about that, because that's just something that happens with squadrons all the time. And in the case of weapons with AoE, when they pass over one squadron, they're all focused on the same target, they're going to get hit multiple times because it's registering multiple impacts. So you're just going to be taking extremely heavy damage. So if you try and focus fire on a target, as I found out, it just doesn't work out. It can work out to help disrupt weapons fire over a larger number of vessels, but with only 5 of them available up until Mark 6, I don't see it as really being worth replacing a switch, because the switches have that active combat role that they succeed in doing. It's odd that they try and do that. But overall, benefits-wise, I think that they should just drop all of the armor bonus and stuff like that, because as I said, as I was watching, when they start to get focused, they just don't last long, especially when they're all stacked on the same target. I would actually prefer it to have a different overdrive entirely. When the Prime Shift activates, what I would like to actually see is mobility benefits for the rest of the fleet, as well as for itself, to bring them slightly more on par with one another. So in the case of something like the switches, actually most of the time it's actually slower than the fleet with the exception of Deadeye, so I would like to see its Prime Shift boost its bolster overdrive to increase its speed so it can actually maintain fleet formation with something like switches and stuff like that, switches, breakers. And in the case of Deadeyes, what I would like to see for the Prime Shift for it, add a general shield bypass trait to its support field, which is this. So when it enters phase, just give it a little bit of a shield bypass, make it so it's actually a little bit more useful when it's in Prime Shift. Secondarily, I do think that a general update needs to be pushed for the spawns, because technically, in my eyes, they do count as a weapon on board the carriers and things like that. And quite a few times, even in the lower level, high level targets, my squadrons just weren't making it to the targets. They were on approach and they were just being cleared out. Sometimes they were being cleared out in a single volley and it just wasn't working out. I couldn't charge it up, so it just wasn't activating. Other times I could get them to the targets, I could start triggering it, I could start getting that charge up, and it was being beneficial. But then it actually activated, and again, it's focused too heavily on squadrons. It's the Imperator all over again in my eyes. Now, I'm only talking about Tier 9 stuff this time. I'll talk about Tier 8 stuff next time, mainly just Dreadnoughts, because they were like the go-to for me. But the go-to this time around is primarily switches and the Dreadnought. And I farmed the Dreadnought with my switches, and I could talk about that in another video, but I want to keep this video short and simple. So, thank you for joining me in this rather unedited video, basically, because it's just a single one-shot video. This is just to be able to get back into the swing of things, get some content out while I start editing other stuff and start prepping some footage that I've been recording. Start commentating on and whatnot. But I'm not staying too well hydrated, as you can probably tell. Much better. But overall, I do think quite a few different things could be different with Tier 9, and I'll do a general video very soon on it, because I actually want to expect that video to be heavily edited, because I've had plenty of practice as of lately. But what I want to see is just generally talk about the fittings and what you use for yours, because this is what I want to do. I want to see what other people are doing different for what they're doing, because I stop paying attention to what other people are doing in the game with their fittings and whatnot. I'd be curious to see who's got similar fittings, who's autoing, who's not, what's working best for them, and whatnot. But thanks for joining me in my pack. Hope you enjoyed the video. Hope you found a little bit of it helpful or intuitive or informative in the case of seeing what I'm doing behind the scenes. Fittings wise, what I'll do is I'll actually screenshot all of these, edit them down, and make sure that in the videos where the vessels are being used, they're always displayed somewhere, probably on the upper left side. It'll just kind of pop in at the beginning of the video or the beginning of a fight and close out whenever they're being used. And the sole intention is to be able to keep everybody informed on what the fittings are so you can see what they're doing and have a general sense of what their power is. As for the Mark 1 to Mark 5 switches, I mainly stuck to Rife during that time frame because it was excelling at everything that I needed it to. But I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to end it here before I drag it on to a 20-minute video. So, once again, thank you for joining me in my pack. Happy hunting, be safe out there in the void, and as always, I'll see you later.